Summer 2023 anime season has mostly come and gone, and the verdicts are out. Here are my unpopular anime opinions. First is Jidou Hanbaiki, which I'll say is a bit underrated. Yes, it's another isekai. There's way too many isekai stories each season, but at least Jidou Hanbaiki tries to differ itself a bit, without it just being an outright gimmick. The idea that a self-aware vending machine can shapeshift into different forms and dispense relevant items based on the situation to support other characters is a nice change of pace. And while he does sometimes just end up being the one to defeat the monsters, he still largely takes a background role and doesn't just invalidate everyone else's existence. Next is Nanatsu no Maken, which I'll say is a bit underrated. The setting seems to be inspired by Harry Potter, although I could be wrong, but it manages to make an interesting twist rather than just leaving it at pure magic, where people yell at each other angrily while waving around their pointy objects. As a bonus, they also hit each other with said objects now. The main characters themselves are also relatively well designed, each with their own backgrounds and attitudes, although some do feel weaker than others. But the strongest aspect is the intrigue of the story, which quickly builds up after episode 6, giving our protagonist a much needed purpose boost. Next is Suki, which I'll say is underrated. A lot of romances in a school setting often makes the male lead have some kind of weird quirk, which makes him somewhat of an outsider to the class, on top of making it so that the male lead is often oblivious to his own feelings or denying any reciprocating love. But Suki gets rid of that fluff and starts with the male lead already in love with the female lead, which allows the story to reach more interesting events quicker. It also explores relatable ideas like struggling to confess, overreacting to basic interactions, and overthinking about being creepy. And while some people may complain about the camera angles, arguably it's what makes it more interesting given a relatively overdone genre. Next is Liar Liar, which I'll say is overrated. The title of the show seemed to imply a story filled with intellectual trickery and deceit, but in reality it's a superficial show about two characters who need to keep up a facade. The main character is incredibly boring, since he has the characteristics of a background character. That is, he has no exceptional ability. On his first day at the academy, he defeats the highest ranked player through sheer luck. But that's not even the main problem. The problem is that the whole game system is basically about cheating through the use of abilities, with abilities being divided between legal and illegal, and for some reason the system has no idea what abilities are illegal. Each game also has different win conditions, but in every game, every player just randomly pulls out new abilities that affect the rules of the game, such as giving the opponents less time or giving the user themselves extra moves. Overall, the whole show just feels pointless, because a lot of abilities either negate the rules, or they're pulled out last minute for a victory, meaning that the entire process of getting to the results was a waste of time. Next is Undead Girl Murder Farce, which I'll say is overrated. The first few episodes were pretty good at presenting the audience with a supernatural focused detective show, such as how would a supernatural creature commit crimes and try to cover them up, based on their innate strengths and weaknesses. But after solving one case, it quickly abandons the detective aspect of the show and just goes full battle mode. The first issue is with Lupin. Once Lupin declared that he was going to steal the gem, it stopped being a detective story. Once we know that Lupin is a criminal, then we've lost the mystery of who committed the crime. And with the crime not having yet occurred, this ends up being more like planning on how to defend against a siege, because we're no longer trying to figure out the facts from the evidence left behind. The second issue, and the greatest disappointment, was the reveal of M. There was no chasing and uncovering of breadcrumbs left behind by M's work, which would eventually lead to Aya and Tsugaru unveiling his identity. M, who turned out to be Moriarty, literally just shows up and confesses that he stole Aya's body, which effectively removes any intrigue built up in the first few episodes. But the unveiling would be unsurprising anyway after Sherlock Holmes was introduced. After the Lupin incident, it does return to the more detective-styled storytelling, but I think the overall suspense has been reduced, because everything afterwards feels more like a side story. Next is Dark Gathering. Although the show hasn't ended yet, I will still give my verdict and say it is a bit underrated. The best part of the show is undoubtedly Yayoi. She's a strong character with a well-defined motive for capturing spirits, and her drive and ruthlessness towards capturing these spirits is what keeps the show engaging. And while Yayoi is great, the progress of the story is unfortunately held back by the other two protagonists, Eiko and Keitaro. Keitaro more so than Eiko. There isn't really much of a reason why they needed to be included in the first place, since Yayoi already had a motive, and was already capturing spirits before she met them. Next is Watashi no Shiawase, which I'll say is overrated. The show spends way too much time on how pitiful Meikyuu is, and her character development is so slow that she almost feels like a background character. But the story does have some saving grace, as the world itself has some intrigue to it, with the introduction of spirits and usage of magical abilities. However, it otherwise feels easily forgettable. The only thing you can take away from this show is an unintended black pill lesson. No matter how well you helped and treated a woman in her darkest times, the moment that she finds a man who's richer, better looking, and of higher status, she will easily move on from you. Next is Rurouni Kenshin, which I'll say is overrated. It's overrated because it's part of the Batman trope. A bunch of bad guys are defeated temporarily and stick around until they're irrelevant to the story, or if they off themselves first. This is an inconsequential type of story, because the protagonist isn't leaving the villains alive because he wants to redeem them. He's simply doing it for personal beliefs. And because he's so powerful, he's never really affected by the actions of the villains anyway. He goes into each encounter and comes out the same person, despite all of the damage that the villain does to everyone else. This also leads to the fights themselves being boring, since they eventually just repeat, given that Kenshin is already at the peak of his abilities. In short, it's a story with no character development, and the fight scenes are just a drawn out I win from the protagonists. Next is Zom 100. Although the show hasn't finished, because of all the delays, I'll still say it is overrated. The main problem is that it keeps interrupting the goofy aspect of the show with serious moments. And what happens is that as the pacing is picking up and it starts feeling wild, these serious moments get introduced and we suddenly lose all momentum. The first time this happened was with the flight attendant. Akira has an emotional talk with Yukari, who ends up dying in front of him, but the experience has no lasting effect on him. The second time is when he encounters his old boss, and out of both coercion and the force of habit, he is manipulated into working for his old boss again, before he is snapped out of the trance. But once again, the experience has no lasting effect on Akira, and it's almost like the event never happened. The show would have been better if these events changed Akira, such as making him have more serious goals. Otherwise, they should have just been excluded entirely. Because right now, the list is absolutely boring. While it should start off simple because of Akira's past, it should have ramped up much quicker into something more ridiculous but still grounded, like trying 100 different ice cream flavors or riding every attraction at a theme park. Because as it stands, the show quickly loses its luster after the first few episodes, since it possesses neither an interesting adventure, character development, or any immersive insight. To sum up everything, here are my verdicts. There were a few titles I enjoyed, but overall this season has been a bit more disappointing than expected.